Hi there. In this, I'm going to be talking about the round four motion from Drexel Pre-Worlds. The motion was about whether the war in Ukraine, that began in February 2022 and continues to the present, has done more harm than good to the Chinese Communist Party. So, in this, I'll walk through sort of three things. The first is a bit of framing on how to approach this debate holistically. The second are some possible gov arguments, and thirdly, some possible op arguments. I'll sort of weave these together based on different clashes to give you a sense of how the debate might play out. Obvious disclaimer, this is not comprehensive or exhaustive. There's a lot that can be said on this topic. You could probably write an entire book, more or less, just on the effects of the Russia-Ukraine war on China and the CCP more broadly. You could have an entire debate on what the interests of the Chinese Communist Party are. So there's quite a lot of depth here, and obviously I won't be able to cover all of it. I'll mostly talk about probably A, some of the more important arguments on both sides, and B, maybe some of the arguments that might be a little bit harder to develop the first time around, or things that perhaps might be useful to think about for subsequent debates about the war in Ukraine or the CCP in general. So, first and foremost, how does the debate shape up to begin with? So, there's almost certainly in most debates on this motion going to be a sort of top level clash, which is what is in the interest of the Chinese Communist Party? And in some cases, this is probably non-controversial. So, for example, it probably is intuitive that the CCP is interested in power preservation, in the maintenance of a strong military, in the projection of economic force domestically, the sort of continued establishment of a strong security apparatus. But there's probably reasonable room for disagreement as to priority. So, for example, there might be one view of the CCP that says the highest interest of the Chinese Communist Party is economic growth domestically. The reason is that economic growth is essential for regime preservation and stability, for avoiding another Tiananmen Square, for ensuring that China has the resources and funds to maintain the support and loyalty of the People's Liberation Army and to avoid a coup. And so, in that sense, there might be one way to view the CCP as primarily an economic agent, but there's a different way to view the CCP, for example, that says the CCP might be more interested in ideological purity or in sort of consistency with the values of Xi Jinping, who has sort of de facto become the dictator in modern China after consolidating power, particularly around 2022, sort of coinciding roughly with the war in Ukraine. And what you might do based upon that is you might make a series of arguments about why the sort of modern CCP, given its dominance by Xi Jinping, might prioritize factors like the sort of exertion of international influence through things like the Belt and Road Initiative or power projection through military means in the South China Sea and East Asia, in and around Taiwan, even when that might come at the expense of economic growth. So, for example, it's arguably the case that China's crackdown on the private tech sector has been economically counterproductive for China in the sense that many private firms in China are highly productive, and yet the CCP particularly during and after COVID, cracked down very heavily on those firms. That might not be evidence that the CCP is just stupid. It might more plausibly be evidence that the CCP's interests are a bit more complicated than just economics alone. So you can probably have a clash on what the core interests of the CCP are. Another example of how this clash might play out is to what extent is the CCP primarily focused on sort of immediate short-term gains as opposed to more speculative long-term considerations? For example, there's probably one way this debate plays out where opening government makes an argument, for instance, about why the war in Ukraine might complicate a future Chinese war over Taiwan, for instance, because Taiwan now receives increased weapons inflows or has higher defense spending, partially attributable to the war in Ukraine or the change in domestic politics in Taiwan as a consequence of the war in Ukraine. And that might be weighed up against a more certain and sort of immediately short-term argument from opening opposition that says, well, China gets lots of cheap Russian oil and gas, which is pretty good for its economy. And so then there's a sort of subclash, which is, well, both of these arguments are plausibly true. One of them is a longer term argument about what might theoretically happen in a subsequent conflict over Taiwan. The other argument is a more immediate argument about the immediate effects on the Chinese economy. And so you can have weighing claims as to which of these two characterizations is more plausible. For example, there might be a claim on the sort of short term end that says the best way for the CCP to maximize its long term interests or objectives is to maximize domestic economic output. For example, if you want to build a strong military, probably the best way to do that is to build a very strong AI sector because AI is very important for military applications, or it's to build up your economy to have a greater tax base to increase spending, for example, on China's nuclear modernization program, which involves the construction of new nuclear silos. The other side might say, well, perhaps China's real interest is longer term. In the immediate short term, there's no real existential threat facing the Chinese Communist Party, given that it still enjoys broadly decent levels of economic growth, even if it's lower than many people would expect or hope for. And more importantly, given the dominance of propaganda, the Great Firewall, the kind of influence of the security apparatus in China that makes any prospect of revolt or a coup very implausible, especially given that the CCP and the sort of PLA remains very loyal to Xi Jinping after the corruption purge, in which millions of Chinese bureaucrats suspected of corruption have been ousted from power. Many of those people are, of course, not loyal to Xi Jinping. Perhaps that's why they were purged. That's a side note, but the broader point is you can have some reasonable arguments either way as to what the CCP's interests are, and that's relevant for framing whatever argument you end up making. For example, if you are on the government side and make an argument about the kind of long-term effect of alliance hardening, for example, NATO sort of becoming revitalized and more viable due to the sudden shock of the war in Ukraine, you might want to weigh the long-term aspects or aspirations of China as having kind of a counterbalancing bulwark against the US-led international order as being more important than the immediate short-term benefits that China might get from increased trade with Russia. There's a couple of specific things, though, that we'll talk about as being in the CCP's interests. One is the immediate effects on the Chinese economy and specific sectors within the Chinese economy, like its tech sector or its energy sector or its manufacturing sector. The second is the sort of geostrategic or geopolitical effects of the war in Ukraine on China, how this might affect China's ambitions for political expansionism in East Asia, the Belt and Road Initiative, so on and so forth. And then lastly, we'll talk a little bit specifically about Taiwan and why Taiwan matters, if it does at all. So before that, just one brief note on arguments that you might consider making about China's relations with countries like the United States or EU. So one thing that's going to be tricky about this motion and something to keep in mind when you're constructing arguments is although the war in Ukraine has had profound effects on modern geopolitics, it is not the only thing that's had profound effects on modern geopolitics. So, for example, there are lots of exogenous reasons, independent of the motion, why the United States and China have increasingly sort of divided ties or have a generally sour relationship. And those reasons have maybe very little to do facially or in truth with what's happening in Russia and Ukraine. For example, general concerns in the United States about China seeking to undermine American hegemony largely exist independent of Russia's gambit for control in the Donbass. And likewise, lots of specific arguments that you might make about, say, the United States imposing sanctions on Huawei. Well, that's an example of an argument that happens well prior to the war in Ukraine. So there are lots of specific illustrations you might point to of things that have happened in the last 3 to 4 years between the United States and China or the United States and EU. But of course, you want to be very precise in this motion of pinpointing the particular effects of the war in Ukraine. So just to give one example of this, one possible argument that we'll talk about in this motion is the sort of downstream political effects of inflation. There might, for example, be an argument that goes something like, look, the war in Ukraine caused a sort of global spike in energy prices and food prices, especially fertilizer prices. And when fertilizer prices go up, that complicates global agricultural supply chains. And the sort of eventual effect of that inflation was the rise of anti-establishment political movements. You might even make an argument, for example, that says the sort of inflationary consequences of the war in Ukraine might have helped Donald Trump to win in 2024 by complicating the US's transition out of inflation. Or they might have contributed, for example, to the rise of the AfD in Germany, given that Germany's been hit pretty hard, for instance, by the sudden cutoff or the relative cutoff of Russian energy. All of these arguments are fair game, but you'll want to be very precise about pinpointing what the specific effect of the war in Ukraine is as opposed to broader exogenous factors. So, for example, maybe it's the case that Donald Trump was elected for reasons that have very little to do with inflation. Maybe, for example, dissatisfaction with large migration flows played a larger role. Maybe specific specific concerns about the Democrats' handling of the 2024 election, like Biden stepping down so late in the race or Harris being perhaps a subpar candidate played a role. So any arguments you might make, particularly about relations between China and the West, probably are going to be a bit tricky to execute. Not that they're bad arguments, just they're going to be tricky to execute because you need to be very careful about identifying what does and doesn't change as a consequence of the war in Ukraine and being very clear in the comparativeness of your arguments. So let's talk a bit about economics. This is not an exhaustive list of arguments. It's just a list of arguments that you might consider making on either side. So on Gov, there's several lines of analysis that you might make. I've sort of listed five. That there are probably six or seven here that you might consider making, and there's probably lots of room for CG to come here, presuming the opening government misses at least one or two of these. So the probably most obvious opening government economics argument, and probably something that maybe there's some vertical room for closing, is just the very simple argument on commodities price shock. The argument is fairly simple. Russia invades in February 2022. The immediate effect is a huge spike in energy prices. The price of oil ended up exceeding $120 a barrel. And there were also downstream effects on agriculture and food prices, particularly wheat prices, but also effects on fertilizer prices, because fertilizer is a major export both in Ukraine and in Russia. And the sort of effects of the war on the Black Sea region, where there's a lot of trade in things like fertilizer and pesticides, had huge downstream effects on global food production, and that worsened inflation. Notably, there were other factors that contributed to inflation, think huge amounts of fiscal stimulus during COVID, or very, very low interest rates and high levels of quantitative easing during the pandemic as a sort of expansionary, stimulative effort to get economies growing again. But you can certainly make a very compelling argument that the war in Ukraine intensified inflation and made these commodities price shocks uniquely worse, particularly in Europe. The reason being that Europe was hit particularly hard, given that it imposed sort of later in 2022, and many of them came into effect in 23 or even 24, a whole range of sanctions on Russian energy that tried to reduce the reliance of European states on energy. And there are several ways that you could probably use this argument as opening government. One might just be a very simple and direct claim, which is even though Russia could sell cheap oil to China, China did suffer in many other ways, for example, from a relative increase in global food prices. And perhaps the other way that you can impact this is just to note that even if China got a bit lucky from the fact that China is the recipient of a glut of cheap oil, lots of China's trade partners, the 140, 150 odd countries in the Belt and Road Initiative, many of those countries suffered economically as a consequence of that commodities price shock. And you might note that many of those countries don't just suffer temporarily, like, well, people now had to spend 10% more at the grocery store. It pushes many countries into sovereign debt crisis. It forces countries to exorbitantly increase their spending on things like fuel subsidies to maintain political popularity. And that might have long run effects on these countries' fiscal health. For example, if they've accumulated too much debt and are at greater risk of a debt crisis. And you might then make arguments as to why China's Belt and Road Initiative projects or why China's trade allies will face economic risks down the road, or more specifically in the last 2 to 3 years, and why that's bad for Chinese exporters, for Chinese manufacturers, and why that has downstream effects on employment in Chinese cities, and so on and so forth. There's another argument you might make on opening government about export controls. It's a little bit technical, but it's a pretty good argument to be familiar with. So for context, BIS, the Bureau of Industry and Security, is this sort of little-known agency in the United States, although technically it was front page of the New York Times several times, so I guess technically it's OIV knowledge. But setting that the technicalities aside, export controls are the term that's used to describe U.S. sanctions on China that particularly target advanced technologies, most importantly, semiconductors. Semiconductors are the very small sort of technologies that are used in just about all modern electronics, from computers to microwaves to refrigerators, you name it, semiconductors are in it. And the United States, in October 2022, imposed a whole sweeping measure of export controls on China, trying to limit A, China's access to advanced semiconductors, and B, limit China's access to the technologies that are required to build advanced semiconductors. So, for example, there's this Dutch company, ASML, that makes these very advanced extreme ultraviolet photolithography equipment systems, which are essential in the production of very, very advanced semiconductors. And the US imposed export controls that European countries complied with to limit / block China from purchasing ASML technologies. The aim, of course, being to sort of choke off China's capacity to build advanced semiconductors domestically to replace the ones that previously Chinese firms bought from the United States. And then the reason the United States is doing this is because semiconductors are very important for artificial intelligence development. You need very advanced AI chips to train AI, and you also need relatively powerful semiconductors, which are sort of important for computing power to do what's called AI inference, which is the actual running of AI models once they're trained and built and up and running, and to keep them alive for customers to work with. Now, obviously, export controls were inevitable. There have been people calling for the U.S. to impose export controls on China for years, even dating back to the Obama administration. What notably you can argue on Gov is there's a pretty plausible argument that the war in Ukraine accelerated the U.S.'s shift to imposing export controls on China. And there's lots of intuitive reasons for this, but probably the most obvious ones are A, one of the concerns the United States had specifically in relation to semiconductors is that if the United States kept selling semiconductors to China, China would then sort of resell many of those semiconductors to Russia, and those semiconductors would then directly be used by the Russian military in the war against Ukraine. And during the Biden administration, that was a very real concern. Jake Sullivan, who is the national security advisor, repeatedly spoke about the sort of risks of dual use technologies, things like semiconductors being used by Chinese firms to sell to Russian firms to be used in the Russian war machine. And so maybe in a world without the war in Ukraine, there would be a slower time scale for the United States to impose those export controls. There's another way you might make the argument more straightforwardly, which is there's kind of always been this kind of balance in US politics and US bureaucracies as to, on the one hand, you might want to do export controls on China if you sort of think that export controls are very crucial for limiting China's access to advanced semiconductors and thus preventing China from building advanced AI. But there's also counter reasons why, export controls are risky. For example, there's lobbying from very many large AI companies that are not thrilled about the fact they can't sell to firms in China. And perhaps a little bit more relevantly, from a security perspective, there are plausible reasons why export controls might be bad even for U.S. security. Like, for example, they might encourage the development of a domestic semiconductor production industry in China. And what happened, you could argue from Gov, is the war in Ukraine shifted that balance within the Biden administration. And the reason is because what the war in Ukraine, even by October 2022, was demonstrating was the importance of artificial intelligence for conflict. And more importantly, as the war sort of dragged on and AI became increasingly integrated into drones, this is more 2023 than 2022, but this also explains subsequent tightening of export controls. The United States started to recognize just how important AI is for warfare. Now, this is, of course, something that had been known or speculated about for years, but it arguably wasn't really until the introduction of autonomous drones into the war in Ukraine. Drones now comprise something like 60 to 70% of casualties in the war, that the United States really started to take note of the centrality of AI and AI-powered drones to conflict. So all of that is maybe a reason to believe export controls were expedited due to the war in Ukraine. Now, to be clear, the Gov argument here shouldn't be absent the war in Ukraine, the United States doesn't do export controls. That's obviously insane. The much more compelling argument, I think, is to say, look, in a world without the war in Ukraine, it's likely the United States would have waited many more months, maybe even a year plus, to impose export controls. Now, this then becomes a debate unto itself. So there's a Gov argument that says export controls are bad for China. They, A, limit Chinese AI firms' access to cutting-edge semiconductors, which limits China's ability to win the AI race. And you can then give reasons why AI is important for global economic growth, for military supremacy, for information warfare, for the use in satellites, etc. But B, it's also bad because export controls affect China's capacity to produce their own advanced semiconductors. And perhaps even a 6, 9, 12, 15, 18-month delay in export controls would have mattered quite a lot for Chinese firms to stockpile, for instance, at the time, very cutting-edge chips that could be used for things like AI inference, which might be a little bit less compute heavy than AI training, but still very much relevant for the adoption of AI technologies in the workforce or in the economy writ large. So there's an export control argument there. For what it's worth, there's also an op claim on export controls. The op claim might go something like, even if export controls were expedited, this might arguably be good for China. The evidence you might give loosely for this is that export controls have actually helped accelerate China's shift towards domestic semiconductor production. In fact, this might actually be something that's in the CCP's direct interests because one of the concerns the CCP had previously and still has to this day is it doesn't want Chinese firms reliant on US technologies, particularly US semiconductor technologies or technologies designed by US firms like Nvidia or AMD or Intel or manufactured by companies like TSMC, which are allied with the United States. TSMC is the large manufacturing company based largely in Taiwan that does semiconductor manufacturing. So you might make arguments as to why export controls are actually good for the CCP and then flip the argument. Next thing that you can talk about are sanctions. It's probably an overrated argument for a gov team just to say, oh, China has directly been sanctioned. There's some truth to that. Some Chinese companies, some Hong Kong companies have been sanctioned due to their ties to the war. I think the more compelling claim you can make vis-a-vis sanctions is two things. The first is just a very direct argument from gov, which is that Russia is a major economic partner for China, and arguably Russia has been hit by sanctions. Now, the relative efficacy of sanctions is debatable. There's a pretty compelling claim on op that says sanctions have largely been ineffective in part because Russia trades so much more with China. But there's a fine claim on Gov that just says intuitively the effect that sanctions have had directly on the Russian economy, even outside oil and gas, might be bad for China's long-term ability to trade with Russia. And the specific argument you might make here is basically to say a large part of the reason why Russia's economy looks, at least on face, pretty healthy-ish is because Russia has basically turned into a Kalashnikov economy. Kalashnikov sort of referencing AK-47, the rifle. And the logic here is basically Russia's economy is more war-oriented than maybe any point since the Soviet Union. And that's partially why Russia's economy maybe looks stronger than it actually is. Russia is producing a bunch of military goods. It's hiring over 1 million soldiers to replace the 1 million casualties it's had in the war. But inevitably, that's not going to endure forever. And at some point in time, Russia's high rates of inflation will catch up to it. Russia's high interest rates will cause a slowdown in growth. Eventually, the war in Ukraine will probably end, and when it does, the Russian economy very plausibly could collapse, and that has lots of downstream effects for China that are probably independently bad, like an increased risk of regime instability in Moscow if there's a risk of popular revolt that inevitably follows the likely crash of the Russian economy post-war. There are direct economic harms to China that come, for instance, from a major trade partner in the long run becoming suddenly poorer. There might even be potential border skirmishes. Remember, although Russia and China today are allies, they've historically had disputes and have even fought minor conflicts over it. And so there's a whole range of arguments you might make there, even if they're a bit high burden and probably hard to execute from OG. The other way that you can make the sanctions argument that probably is a bit lower burden and I think more intuitive to most judges is just a compliance costs argument, which is there are plenty of Chinese companies that do business internationally and they do business in the United States. The reason is because the United States is the world's largest consumer market in the world and it has huge purchasing power and the US dollar remains the world's reserve currency. And lots of Chinese firms now have to prove that they're compliant with US sanctions or EU sanctions on Russia. And that just creates huge compliance costs, which bites into firms' profit margins. It reduces the relative profitability of Chinese firms relative to Western firms. And you can then impact why this is a particularly bad moment in time for all of these harms to happen. For example, the Chinese economy is facing a whole range of economic problems, from a local government financing crisis to the property crisis to a high-speed rail debt crisis to an aging population to the negative economic effects that come from a lack of stimulus to the heavy-handed crackdown on the tech sector. All of this might be reasons why, there are some pretty bad effects that come from even a modest reduction in the profitability of Chinese enterprises that increases the risk of things like layoffs, increases the risk of popular unrest, and so on and so forth. The next argument you might make on Gov economically is just arguments about why dependence on Russian energy is bad. This argument might be sellable in debate land. It's a little harder to buy in real life. Roughly something like, depending on what numbers you trust, 20-ish% maybe of Chinese energy today is imported from Russia. There might be arguments here that say, well, look, it is potentially risky to be sort of dependent on Russian energy. And the reason why there's dependence is, yeah, Russia's not, giving 100% of China's oil, but 20% is a large enough stake that, China can't just replace that overnight. And that might create problems where if Russia suddenly threatened, for instance, to shut off the oil pipelines to China, that could do real damage to the Chinese economy. And you might then make arguments as to why this complicates China's bid for Eurasian power, particularly in Central Asia. For example, there are plenty of countries in Central Asia, like Kazakhstan, for instance, where both Russia and China vie for influence, culturally, economically, socially, and so forth. And it might plausibly be the case that if China is at least somewhat beholden to Russia, given there is the credible fear that sort of Putin, who can sort of exercise madman theory, might say, well, if you don't, for instance, agree to permit increased Russian influence in Kazakhstan, then, maybe we'll reconsider those oil contracts that might potentially limit flexibility in Chinese foreign policy. The reason I say this is a bit of a suspicious argument is because dependence cuts both ways, and of course, Russia might also be at least modestly dependent on China, in the sense that China is the largest export market for Russian energy, and this is, of course, probably a pretty compelling op response. Maybe the way you get around that is A, to make an argument about madman theory, like Putin, for example, can pretty credibly posture as willing to inflict economic pain on his own regime for ideological sake. Arguably, that's the entire reason the war began in the first instance. Or there might just be a simpler argument that says even if China has some leverage over Russia, Russia has sufficient leverage over China, especially given that Russia can sell to alternative countries. Think Turkey, think India, think Brazil, and so forth. And so that might be reasons why Russia does, in fact, have a decent bit of bargaining power in this context. Of course, that argument is also vulnerable to a fair op responsive, but China has other places it can buy oil. It buys quite a lot of OPEC produced oil, Iranian oil, Venezuelan oil, and so forth. Two other arguments on Gov for econ. One is an argument that I'll discuss more on the next slide, but basically there's a de-risking argument. So de-risking is the practice of Western companies and countries trying to shift their supply chains out of China. This began partially during COVID as a response to the zero COVID lockdowns, and partially just due to geopolitical tensions between the United States and China, and it will probably continue accelerating under Trump due to the tariffs. There might be an argument that, and I think there's a reasonable argument on Gov that says that de-risking has been intensified by the war in Ukraine. Part of the reason why is you have to remember that if you're a European company in particular, the war in Ukraine sort of shattered what you believed for decades, which is that continental war in Europe was basically unthinkable. The European Union and sort of European integration had more or less reduced the risk of conflict to basically zero. And on February 24th, 2022, that illusion was shattered violently and bloodily. And that does create a very real impetus for companies to seriously reconsider where they're doing business. And of course, there is a real concern that, this pushes countries to companies, to seriously reconsider having their supply chains in China. And the intuitive reason why is A, China plays a direct role in the war in Russia. So maybe there's just a direct argument that, for example, countries in the EU might be a bit skeptical, for instance, about having extensive economic ties with China. But there's a more tangible argument, which is realistically, the world's most dangerous flashpoint is Taiwan. And there's a very real chance that a war breaks out in Taiwan in the next 10, 20, 30 years. If you're a company, you probably suddenly are way more afraid now of there being a war in Taiwan because the norm against state invasion has been badly damaged by the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And the perceived risk of a war in Taiwan is at all-time highs. And that might plausibly be a reason why you want to yeet the fuck out of China sooner than later so that you don't get caught with your supply chains embedded in a country that in 5, 6, 10 years is actively invading Taiwan and getting sanctioned massively by the West. The argument you might more broadly make here on de-risking is, particularly in Europe, this might apply more there. After the Cold War, there was very much a belief in many European countries, Germany is the canonical example, that you could integrate your economies and supply chains with historically hostile countries, and in doing so, reduce the risk of conflict. So much of the logic behind the Nord Stream projects, for example, was explicitly that by linking the German and Russian economies, the probability of conflict between Moscow and Berlin would go down. That's in fact a kind of core fundamental tenet of the EU writ large as kind of an economic bloc. That logic was badly shattered when Russia invaded Ukraine, because what that basically demonstrated is that rogue authoritarian states with revanchist ambitions maybe can't be deterred through fears of economic sanctions and punishment. And that's why the shift towards de-risking has intensified so greatly since the invasion of Ukraine. The impact of that is sort of companies pulling out of China. That's why lots of companies might, for like Apple, for example, is moving factories out of China into India, out of China into Vietnam, out of China into Mexico, and so forth. And you can make arguments of why this is bad for China's manufacturing sector. It worsens the youth unemployment crisis, etc. Last economics thing that's worth chatting about is like there might be politics arguments. I mentioned this earlier, but there's a potential argument here, which is like there has been a rise in sort of right-wing populist movements that might be causally attributable to the indirect effects of the war in Ukraine. So just to be clear, the argument you probably should make is not like people are voting far right because of the war in Ukraine. A very small number of people might be, but it's certainly not definitive or electorally determinative. The better argument is inflation is a major driver of support for anti-incumbent and anti-establishment parties, and inflation was greatly intensified, particularly 2022 and 23 by the invasion, and also caused interest rates to go up, which has sort of its own slew of negative economic effects. And so you might make arguments that say the rise of people, perhaps like Donald Trump in the second term, is partially related to the war in Ukraine. Of course, there's a slight problem with this argument, which is just proving the specific uniqueness. Why did the war in Ukraine cause this specifically? The other thing that you'd probably want to prove in this argument to make it stick is like you have to do the impacting on why, for example, it actually is bad for the CCP that Trump came to power. This itself is an entire clash. That's why I listed it as a potential op argument as well, which is there might just be an op claim that says Donald Trump has been great for the CCP. There's this kind of concept of great power suicide, which is basically the United States as sort of mutilating its own economic and geopolitical advantages by basically doing lots of things that are terrible for the US's international power and fantastic for China's bid for regional hegemony. So examples of that might be US tariffs have driven tons of countries closer to China if they no longer view the United States as a credible trading partner. The United States sort of openly questioning its commitment to NATO has arguably badly damaged the EU's faith in the U.S. relations with NATO and Europe writ large, and that might, for example, damage the West holistically, which is good for China's long-term ambitions of undermining a Western-led international order. You might make specific arguments about Trump cutting foreign aid being good for China. That means that there's more appetite than ever before for countries to accept BRI loans and projects and grants and aid, etc. So you can make a whole bunch of arguments on op that says it's great that, for example, Trump was elected, or make similar arguments about, I don't know, France in 2027 maybe will be indirectly affected, although that argument seems hard to fathom, or maybe a series of other European elections in the interim. The other way that you could spin this on Gov is to say, actually, we think Donald Trump has been pretty bad for China. One way to prove that maybe is just to note the generally quite hawkish stance on China is shared both by the Democrats and Republicans, but is perhaps more pronounced in the Republican Party. Interestingly, that's maybe not true from what we've seen thus far in the Trump 2.0 administration. Trump has been, with the exception of some harsh rhetoric on China and a brief escalation in the trade war, where the United States had up to 145% tariffs on China, the actual policy has been in many ways pretty similar to the Biden administration. So it might not be the case that Trump is actually that much more hawkish on China, but you certainly can make arguments as to why U.S. tariffs on China are bad for Chinese exports to the United States, which is a major export market for Chinese firms, manufacturers, and so forth. You can probably also make arguments as to why this is a uniquely bad moment in time for Trump to be in power for China. For example, Trump has kind of made efforts through policy and also just the kind of unintentional effects of his policies to devalue the dollar, which means that U.S. exports become internationally more competitive, which sort of undercuts Chinese exports in a way that might be bad for the Chinese economy. So there's a pretty rich politics clash here where either side can make arguments as to why it's good or bad. For example, that the war in Ukraine has contributed in some way to the rise of political figures like Trump. Econ arguments on op that you might think about. There are some pretty sensible arguments that you might make on op about just increased trade between Russia and China. The simplest of these arguments is the sort of energy glut argument. This argument sounds intuitive, but it actually requires a good bit of proof to execute properly. So the way you want to make the argument about oil probably says something like, because Russia is heavily sanctioned by the EU and because Russia is subject to the G7 price cap, this means that China can purchase large bulks of Russian oil with de facto, well, it's not really monopsony power, but it's close to monopsony power because China is sort of by a decent margin the largest buyer of Russian energy. And that means that Russia can basically China can demand huge discounts. And that means that China gets a huge flood of cheap energy. There's a couple of ways you can impact impact that. One is just the direct effects. It's good for China's economy to have cheaper energy because energy is an input to lots of things, heating, air conditioning, manufacturing, and so forth. Steel manufacturing is a classic example you could use of a very energy intensive manufacturing process that China's historically played a key role in. But there's also another way to impact it, which is the sort of Malacca Strait argument. The argument goes basically like one of the biggest geostrategic concerns China has right now is that a lot of its oil and gas is imported via maritime tanker from largely the Middle East or Northern Africa. Think countries like Saudi Arabia. That's a problem for China because most of that oil currently passes through what's called the Strait of Malacca, which is a very narrow waterway. That cuts right next to Singapore. Singapore is a U.S. Military ally, and the United States Seventh Fleet routinely patrols the Malacca Strait, and that creates a choke point concern for China, which is China could theoretically have its oil imports choked off if the Strait of Malacca is shut to Chinese maritime trade, or at bare minimum, it would force Chinese tankers to take a much more expensive route to China, which would be economically disastrous to China. The benefit of Russian energy then is that something like a fifth of Russia's energy now can come overland because you have gas pipelines and oil being imported from Russia into China that doesn't require transit via the Malacca Strait. And that's good for China's ability to reduce its potential vulnerability to a US sanctions campaign. So that's how you might make the argument on energy. You can also make the argument about trade in other contexts. So there's a simple argument that, for example, says that Russia now buys lots of dual use technologies, things like electronics, things like semiconductors from China. The specific reason it's buying these things more now, both is partially a consequence of sanctions, but also more broadly because Russia needs these things for its military. And so China can kind of play both sides, which is to say, China can avoid the worst of the sanctions campaign by not selling lethal weapons to China or Russia directly, although it has done that more recently. But especially in the past, it can get lots of funds by just selling things like semis to Russia. And that is sort of good for China's economic growth. And that's sort of beneficial for Chinese manufacturers, Chinese tech firms, so on and so forth. And there are also, by the way, lots of other arguments you might make about why other countries that have sort of been affected by sanctions or secondary sanctions also have shifted more and more towards China because China can sort of portray itself as a relatively more neutral country. We'll talk a bit more about the geopolitics and optics stuff in a sec. Other miscellaneous arguments on op. There's a renewables argument. The probable I haven't thought much about this argument, but probably the way that you could make the argument is many countries responded to the price shock in oil and gas by increasing their interest in the use of renewables because that's sort of, this is a good opportunity for center left or even center right parties that are concerned about climate change and the reliance on renewables to pivot away from fossil fuels towards renewables. And that's great for China because China is sort of leading internationally in the production of things like solar panels and photovoltaic cells and electric vehicles. And so lots of those countries end up buying from China. That's good for China's renewable sector, and that also fuels China's economy. There's an argument on financial statecraft. The argument basically is China is attempting to de-dollarize much of the international financial system. What that means, in effect, is that China is trying to reduce the international economy's reliance on the dollar and to shift countries towards the use of the yuan, the Chinese currency, or the RMB. And maybe one way that this is become accelerated more recently is the freezing of Russian assets by the EU and United States has alarmed very many countries, including countries that are not explicitly allied with China or BRICS more broadly, because there are credible concerns that what if our assets get frozen as well? What if our central banking or foreign exchange reserves get frozen? And that means that there's a pretty compelling argument that lots of countries now are much more amenable, for example, to doing RMB denominated trade. They're more willing to toy with the idea of BRICS payment systems using alternative currency arrangements like central bank backed digital currencies or CBDCs. There are lots of arguments you might make about why this is generally good for kind of increasing international buy-in to China's efforts to shift away from a US dollar-based financial system, and why that's good for China's soft power, good for the strength of the RMB, good for the internationalization of the yuan, and all of that. And of course, there's the politics arguments I kind of alluded to before that you might make. You could also make arguments of why de-risking is good, why it's good for China to not be as reliant on Western companies, and why the shift towards state-owned enterprises is good for the CCP because it gives the CCP greater control over the economy. These all seem like viable economics lines for op. Let's talk geopolitics. So there's a lot that you can say on geopolitics on either side. So On Gov, couple of thoughts. There's an alliance fortification Gov. The argument basically goes there are lots of Western countries today that are much more closely allied than they were previously, and they have increased security cooperation, specifically in response to the war in Ukraine. The obvious example of this would be NATO. If you think about what NATO was like circa 2020 or 2021, it was very much an alive organization. It was obviously still expanding, but NATO was not nearly as influential as it is, arguably, at least today. And the simple reason is because you can sort of apply like group threat theory, which basically is like part of what causes groups to consolidate and to cooperate more is when they face an external threat. And the Russian invasion of Ukraine created that external threat. And that has immediate implications like for NATO militarization. Like there are a bunch of countries in Europe today that are militarizing pretty aggressively directly because they suddenly think Russia might attack them. Why is Poland spending 4.5% of its GDP on defense? It's not a coincidence. Why is Germany reforming its constitution to increase defense spending? Same deal. Why are even countries like France considering increasing defense spending? Why is Europe, through Project Rearm Europe, looking to spend 800 billion euros on defense modernization? Why is NATO writ large so interested in building up its presence in Eastern Europe and increasing collaboration and adding countries like Finland and Sweden? All of this is largely because the threat posed by an aggressive Russia shattered the illusion of post-Cold War peace in Europe, and that has sort of intensified alliances. Why is that bad for China? Well, you can make lots of arguments. One just might be an ideological claim, which is that the CCP's interest is to undermine the Western-based order, and the invasion of Russia did exactly the opposite of that, which is, at least for a period of sort of two-ish years, three-ish years basically, it pretty solidly intensified. Cooperation between Western states. Not even just NATO. Think like cooperation between Japan and South Korea, for instance, kicked up even more after the invasion of invasion of Ukraine, because they too started worrying more about the potential for North Korean or Chinese aggression in East Asia. And those are two countries that have historically had a very fractious relationship, owing in large part to the historical atrocities committed by Japanese forces against Korean civilians during Japanese occupation in World War II. But why is that alliance growing stronger? Well, part of it is because these countries are legitimately concerned by what they see going on in Russia and Ukraine. They worry it might happen to them too. And that undermines China's ambition of sort of detracting support from this Western-led international order. It's also bad tangibly, which is just that it's much harder for China to penetrate, for example, into the EU as an economic partner when the EU is increasing collaboration, when Euroscepticism might be on the decline, at least in part, when there's more willingness for countries to collaborate with other for sake of defense, for sake of trade, because there's this shared sense of identity that's birthed from the presence of an external threat. And so all of that undermines China's ambitions to expand the Belt and Road Initiative into Eastern or Southern Europe. It undermines China's ability to project power into places like Central Europe, and that's probably bad for China's ambitions. It's also bad for China's security ambitions in East Asia. Countries like Australia, India, Japan, South Korea are increasing security cooperation. AUKUS has intensified since the Russian invasion of Ukraine. The Quad is increasing in collaboration. The Japan, US, South Korea sort of trilateral relations intensified, at least under Biden, maybe a bit less so under Trump. But, there's still a reasonable argument there that this set in process a broader shift towards closer relations between those two countries. And that's maybe bad for China's military expansion in the region. It's harder, for example, to assert control over the South China Sea when countries in the region are much more confident in their militaries, when they have more access to foreign weapon systems and so forth. There's a second geopolitics claim on Gov that says, look, it's very arguable that the Russian invasion of Ukraine is just independently inconsistent with CCP values, and geopolitically this is bad for the CCP. There might be a claim, for example, that says the CCP is at its core mostly concerned with sovereignty. The CCP, remember, has sort of long championed itself as a defender of sovereignty. One of the core refrains from CCP officials is that the West is this interventionist power. It invades Iraq and Afghanistan. It bombs Libya and Serbia. It went to war in Korea, and it went to war in Vietnam. And
in all of these ways, the West, even still in other ways, the International Monetary Fund dictating your economic policy, the World Bank imposing austerity, the West trying to spread color revolutions through Radio Free Europe. Like all these are things that China says this is interventionist, this is violative of country sovereignty. The Russian invasion of Ukraine kind of explicitly is a violation of sovereignty, and like China can try to, dodge this a bit, but the parallels to Taiwan also are a bit alarming. Like, a big, powerful military attacking a relatively small country it considers to have a historic or cultural tie to. Like, the tie to Taiwan is pretty obvious, and that might create optics problems down the road for China. The more tangible problem this creates, though, is just that if you're China, it might not be optically good for your image as a non-interventionist power if the one of the countries that most countries internationally think of as your chief ally or one of your chief allies is actively involved in a pretty brutal war in Ukraine. A fair op response, of course, to this is just to note that many countries are actually somewhat neutral on this. There are plenty of countries. It's a kind of common myth in some Western circles that like there's this big international coalition where everyone's on Ukraine's side and everyone hates Russia. And the reality, of course, is it's a bit more complicated than that. And it's more complicated than that for maybe two reasons. One is just like lots of countries are legitimately skeptical of the West's claim. There are lots of countries that do think of NATO as the aggressor here. And part of that is because they see a history of Western expansion and aggression and question the West's authenticity on this. Like there are plenty of countries that kind of have openly wondered, why should we condemn the Russian war in Ukraine if the United States can invade Iraq with impunity? There's a second reason, which is that lots of countries are just in the business of hedging. So lots of countries are unwilling to pick sides. The main reason for this, or at least the reason I like to give in debate, feel free to use it. It's not like I own the argument, but it's a kind of my preferred justification, is lots of countries saw the message from the Cold War. And the message from the Cold War is look at what happens to countries that side explicitly. Answer, it's often not good for them. So, North and South Vietnam picked who they sided with, and look at what happened to both of them. Not great things. You can make similar arguments about other countries that saw military coups and civil wars from picking sides. And maybe the better strategy is to become non-aligned, to hedge, to not say you're allied with China or the United States. And that might be why countries are reluctant to explicitly side, for example, with, say, Ukraine. And so there's a fair op response here that says actually China benefits from the sort of situation in Russia and Ukraine, which is that China gets to portray itself as kind of the leader of this middle ground. It can sort of try to appeal to countries that are fence sitters, that aren't trying to explicitly back Ukraine or back Russia. And in that way, China might actually position itself as kind of the leader, so to speak, of non-aligned states, which is a bit odd, of course, given that China and the United States are the world's two largest geopolitical forces, but certainly the argument can be made. There's another argument on de-risking. I sort of talked about this argument earlier. There are geopolitical implications of it as well, but you can sort of think about the analysis from earlier and apply it here. There might be some arguments about relations between European states. I wrote Europe-EU relations. That should obviously be Europe-China relations. Oops, bad typo. Of course, this is what I mentioned at the very beginning of the presentation. There are arguments about why EU-China relations have deteriorated, or in specific countries, relations have deteriorated, and that's problematic. At the same time, if you're op, you can probably question this in a few ways. One is just to say exactly how true is this? Like a couple weeks ago, Spain signed a deal with Huawei for where Huawei is basically handling all of the data for arrest warrants and phone tapping warrants in the Spanish legal system. So, kind of small example, but empirically, it at least raises the question of how big this anti-China backlash is. But the more serious and maybe less dismissive response you might give is just look, there are tons of exogenous factors at play that influence China-EU relations beyond the war in Ukraine. And at the end of the day, it is Russia that's fighting in Ukraine, not China. And China has gone to pretty substantial lengths to distance itself from the war in Ukraine, not necessarily condemning the war, but China is not in the business of openly advertising itself as selling tanks and missiles to Russia. And so in that way, China might have some plausible deniability, which limits the damage that's done to EU-China relations. And same might apply to the United States as well. That being said, there's probably a gov argument on why this has generally deteriorated relations between key European powers like Germany and France and China. And that has implications for example, the level of tariffs that the EU imposes on Chinese goods like electric vehicles, solar panels, etc., which limits China's ability ability not just to grow economically, but also to establish itself as the global power in key technologies, things like solar panels. There's one other way that you might think about the geopolitics here on Gov, which is a general argument on just increased territorial aggression. Like there might be a pretty reasonable claim that says the world has just become a much more volatile and scary place since the invasion. And the causal link here might be a little tricky. Like, would you have something like the 10/7 attack and the subsequent war in Gaza, or would you have the Sudan civil war, or would you have, all these miscellaneous conflict flare-ups like Thailand, Cambodia, or Armenia, Azerbaijan, etc. In a world where you didn't have the war in Ukraine? And the answer is it's kind of impossible to tell. Some of them might be cleaner than others. So there is a pretty fair argument, for instance, that says the kind of two wars between Armenia and Azerbaijan, one of them in 2022, one of them in 2023, maybe wars isn't the right word as much as skirmishes. Those probably did happen with higher probability due to the war in Ukraine because Armenia's historic sponsor was Russia. Russia was preoccupied with the Ukrainian counteroffensives, for instance, in Kherson and Kharkiv back in 2022, which is sort of why the 2022 conflict escalated in Armenia, Azerbaijan. But there are other places where, the link might be a little bit more tenuous. Like, it's not really clear that like the SAF RSF infighting has anything much to do directly with the war in Ukraine. That being said, you can make a general argument on Gov that says the war in Ukraine has really substantially damaged two things. The first is the norm against territorial aggression, and the second is the norm against nuclear saber rattling. That's where there's a general norm. It's sort of called the nuclear taboo against countries openly using nuclear threats. And both of those have sort of been violated by the war in Ukraine, which obviously violated the norm against non-intervention. And also, Russia's frequent threats to use military and nuclear force have badly damaged the nuclear taboo. And you might make arguments on Gov as to why this is independently bad for China. Instability probably is bad for Chinese business. It's bad for trade. It increases the risk of attacks against Chinese infrastructure. It reduces China's ability to work with stable governments, and it reduces China's ability to have long-term guarantees, for example, that its alliances and investments will yield gains. And also has miscellaneous effects on like China's ability to project force regionally. If, for example, the region holistically in East Asia, in South Asia, in the Middle East, in Central Asia, wherever you want to name it, becomes generally more volatile or prone to conflict. And so you might make arguments as to just why, in general, the deterioration of international security is bad for China's interests, and this is at least in part attributable to the war in Ukraine. On op, there's a couple of arguments that might come to mind. One argument on geopolitics is an argument on leverage. And this is actually a very compelling argument for what it's worth. The argument essentially is Russia is a country with substantial influence, but today is arguably in some ways, maybe a vassal state is going too far, but certainly is very heavily influenced by China for the somewhat trivial reason that China has more power over Russia than vice versa. Because if you're Russia, you depend desperately on Chinese technologies, on Chinese purchases of Russian oil and gas, on Chinese cooperation to evade Western sanctions. And in that way, China has lots of influence over Russia. And that has tangible benefits for China, like it reduces the risk of border skirmishes with Russia. It means that Russia is relatively more subservient to China in cases where Russian foreign policy conflicts with Chinese foreign policy. It means that Russia is more, in the long run, likely to act as sort of a vassal state of the CCP. And all of that probably is good both for minimizing the damage that Russia can do to China and maximizing the benefits that Russia can provide for China. There's another way to view the alliance fortification argument, which is sort of two things. One is, although maybe NATO has been strengthened by the war in Ukraine, it's also the case that kind of like the quote unquote CRINC alliance, which is an awful acronym basically standing for China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, has also been strengthened. And the reason why is although people think of these countries as kind of homogeneously unified, they all have their individual disputes and disagreements over the course of history. Like, for example, the relationship between China and North Korea is not purely positive. But the war in Ukraine sort of brought all these countries together in the sense that it kind of bonded them. Oh, well, okay, that makes it sound too emotional, but it kind of gave these countries a unified enemy that kind of increased economic trade flows and security cooperation between all of these countries. So even just think about the way that these four countries work in the war in Ukraine. Russia is using Chinese semiconductors, it's using Iranian drones, and it's using North Korean artillery shells. And that's sort of a simple example of how this four-way alliance has strengthened materially since the war began. And so you might make the argument that, yeah, maybe it's bad that NATO, for example, is a more potent security alliance today than it was 5 years ago for China. But it's much more important to China that it has close economic and security ties with this quote unquote axis of resistance, or whatever you might like to call it, which has the ability to project force against US allies. Think Israel, think Saudi Arabia, think NATO. Think South Korea. And also, this helps China in kind of generally counterbalancing US influence because it has a range of de facto proxies to sort of undermine the United States. There's a second way that you can make the alliance claim, though, which is just to note that the United States and Europe have arguably been kind of in some way bled dry by this conflict. So there's one argument that's often made in favor of the U.S. giving aid to Ukraine, which is, look, the reason the United States should love giving aid to Ukraine, even from a selfish perspective, is that this is basically just a free way, or a basically free way, just the cost of military aid to kind of bleed the Russian military, right? Like just give Ukraine everything it wants, and Ukraine does all the bloody work for you of killing the Russian soldiers. And from the US perspective, that's probably strategically advantageous. But the same argument also works from the Chinese US perspective, which is to say the United States is, sending huge amounts of resources. Same thing is true of Europe to Ukraine. And bluntly, if you're China, you don't have that huge of a reason to care directly about Ukraine. I mean, you sell them drones, but it's not like Ukraine is essential to you. And so in that way, what the war in Ukraine basically does is it kind of lets China more or less exhaust the West's military and political resources. I say military resources in the sense that the West has burned through a lot of its stockpiles of artillery shells and missile interceptors in a way that might increase China's ability to project force in the South China Sea, because it sort of has a credible claim of escalation dominance because its military is not as exhausted by its kind of continued support for Ukraine. But you can also make the argument in kind of just a separate way, which is like from the Chinese point of view, like it's kind of valuable to waste as many Western political resources as possible in justifying this increasingly forever war in Ukraine. And maybe that means that, in future cases where China acts aggressively, like seizing territory that belongs to the Philippines or maybe blockading Taiwan, it's plausible that people's frustrations over the war in Ukraine will hang over their reactions to Chinese escalation in East Asia. And maybe if people have the memory of 4 years of grinding war in Ukraine that went nowhere fresh in their memory, they might be a bit less inclined, for example, to authorize the deployment of peacekeepers to Taiwan or support U.S. military intervention in a war between the U.S. and the Philippines. So there might be just a kind of political trade-off argument there. And that also kind of covers what I've loosely called the geo-distraction or geostrategic distraction. And I talked about the consistency with CCP values a bit earlier, just to concretize that. There's a different way of thinking about CCP values, which is that one of the CCP's core objectives when it comes to international politics is sort of expanding Chinese influence. And maybe one of the better ways to do that is to sort of undermine the image of the West as a peacekeeper. And arguably that has happened. NATO, for many countries, is the aggressor here. It looks like the aggressor. And the inability of the United States to negotiate an end to the war is pretty humiliating for Trump, and certainly makes the United States look weak internationally, which might be good for China's international power projection. Lastly, some arguments on Taiwan. Why does China care? Well, there are historical reasons relating to the century of humiliation and the reunification of Taiwan being a core objective of the Chinese Communist Party. There might be specific reasons for Xi Jinping, like a concern about his legacy and a desire to maintain power, even amidst domestic economic problems by, exploiting the rally around the flag effect and attacking Taiwan. There might be economic reasons like the desire to take Taiwan's semiconductor industry. There might generally be reasons that as Taiwan drifts closer and closer towards the United United States and the percentage of Taiwanese people identifying as exclusively Taiwanese rises. China might believe that peaceful reunification is increasingly impossible. And those are all reasons why A, China might care about Taiwan, and B, it's plausible that an invasion could happen, especially A, the United States is maybe not a super credible ally these days, given that Trump might plausibly not intervene to defend Taiwan. B, in general, China's military has modernized dramatically in the last 5 to 10 years. It's outproducing the US in ship capacity at a 200-to-1 ratio. Its nuclear arsenal is now over 600 nuclear warheads. It has pretty advanced satellite networks that might be able to rival the United States when it comes to information warfare. China's weapons and long-range missiles are probably precise enough to hit US military bases as far away as Hawaii or Guam or the North Mariana Islands. The point is that China has the military capability to target Taiwan. C, it's plausible that China might view its window to attack Taiwan as closing, especially given the aging population and the fact that Xi Jinping probably does care a lot about the 2027 or 2049 centennial dates. 2027 is the 100-year anniversary of the PLA, the army, and 2049 is the 100-year anniversary of China's founding. October 1, 1949 is when Mao Zedong proclaimed the People's Republic of China. All of those are reasons why A, China cares about Taiwan, B, an invasion is plausible. Arguments you might make on either side. On Gov, there's a pretty simple argument that Taiwan spends more on defense now than it did previously. This might have happened anyway, but the intuitive reason it happened more is because the war in Taiwan is partially why, in particular, the DPP, which is one of the main political parties in Taiwan, has become more concerned about defense spending, and that's why defense spending in Taiwan has risen. They've also reformed their conscription services to try to maximize Taiwan's ability to resist a Chinese invasion. That's obviously bad from the CCP's perspective. Taiwan has also overhauled much of its security doctrine. It places a much greater emphasis now on drone production and the use of what are called uncrewed or unmanned weapon systems, so things like drones, for example, as a way to shift away from bulky conventional weapons that probably won't fare very well in war, like diesel submarines that are very easy for Chinese hydrophones to pick up on and then hit through torpedoes. So there's probably a simple argument that just says Taiwan responded to the war in Ukraine by sort of beefing up its defenses, and that means that any subsequent Chinese escalation around Taiwan, whether that's a blockade or a small naval skirmish or an outright invasion, will be less likely to succeed and more likely to be bloody. There's also just a simple argument, which is that like the West is now more supportive of Taiwan because Taiwan is the kind of obvious parallel to Ukraine, and that's why, for example, countries like Japan or South Korea might be increasing security dialogue, or the United States or EU in the long run by remilitarizing in response to the war in Ukraine after the shock of the conflict, will have increased military capacity to donate munitions, weapons, missile interceptors, batteries, etc. to Taiwan, and that sort of increases the deterrence against a conflict or an invasion in the long term, which might undermine China's sort of strategic flexibility. You might also just make a direct argument that like the United States is like more concerned today about a war over Taiwan than it was in the past. That's why the United States is actively trying to do things like beef up drone production, increase its shipbuilding capacity, integrate AI into the military, remilitarize airfields at Guam and Saipan to increase the US's capacity to fight a long-range war against China. And in that way, all of the kind of security dimensions of a conflict around China become harder. And you might also make an argument that the United States has been pushed to recognize the importance of drones in a way that it wasn't previously. And that might mean that the United States is more likely to fight a modern war effectively and not be held back by doctrine in a way that makes the United States more likely to prevail in a conflict. There's also a boring argument that I don't much like, but I guess you can run, which is like the US has been battle testing a bunch of weapons in Ukraine, things like ballistic missile defense or network-centric information warfare technologies for things like drone jamming or spoofing. And, you know, the United States benefits asymmetrically from this compared to China because China's not deploying as many offensive weapon systems to Ukraine as the United States is. And that gives the United States lots of valuable information about how weapon systems can be combined and deployed and how they fare in real 21st century drone-oriented combat. On op, there's a series of arguments you can make as to why Taiwan becomes easier to seize. There might be an argument on just trivially, like China has a much better idea of how the West would respond to an invasion. Like China knows the likely sanctions playbook that the United States and the European Union would pull out. China knows the likely role of drones in such a conflict. The sort of general logistics supply chains that have allowed the West to fund and arm and train Taiwan are much better understood by China now than they probably were 10 or 15 years ago. So China's capacity to fight a conflict or blockade Taiwan is just much easier given all of this information. There might also just be a direct argument on diversion of resources, like I mentioned earlier. Like the United States, for example, is kind of notoriously lagging in artillery production, but also in like key inventories of things like PAC-3 missile interceptors, which are important for missile defense. And so in that way, like the capacity of the West to A, arm Taiwan and B, directly fight on behalf of Taiwan might be limited for several years, and that creates a very valuable window of opportunity for Taiwan. And there might also be the sort of body bag, like war fatigue effect argument I talked about earlier, that it's plausible that people will have the kind of haunting memories of Ukraine in their head if conflict arises over Taiwan. Those are most of the arguments that I think you can make on Taiwan. This is, of course, not exhaustive. Lots of other things to be said, but hopefully this covers most of it. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out.